it seems to me like this is a sustainable rally, and that we're going to most likely continue to see prices moving up from here until we get to another, big kind of, acceleration point again, and then another blow off top, and it'll just most likely we'll be through several more of these until crypto gets to the point where it's a big enough market that it's not so easy to do this because.
The land of Arcadia was a model of its time.
Hello there, my friends. Chris Marcus here with you for Arcadia Economics, and excited to have a good friend and my resident crypto expert, Robert Allen of COINCUBE, to help figure out what's going on with the cryptos. We've seen wild volatility, and it's great to have Robert on. He's actually the first person I ever remember talking about Bitcoin back in 2011, I believe, and also has a coding background. So in a whole other level can understand the cryptos. And Robert, great to have you on here today. How are you doing, my friend?
Hey, Chris. I'm doing well. Thanks for having me back. It's always fun to come and chat with you about this stuff.
Yeah, well, let's see. Lots happened since the last time we talked. Bitcoin and all the cryptos, especially the alt tokens, have been whacked pretty thoroughly over the past year and a half almost now. Then we've seen a rebound over the past month. So I guess first, any thoughts on an overview of the market right now?
Yeah, I think we are probably at that point in these market cycles where we're starting to see accumulation back into Bitcoin and some of the other crypto assets. It's possible we could see a further dip and another kind of bear period. Obviously, that's possible, but Bitcoin was at an all-time, the all-time longest bear market was what we just experienced for Bitcoin. I think it was a year and a half-ish, something like that.
Reminded me of the silver market.
Yeah, it was a grueling winter for those of us who are following closely. But it to me, honestly, at this point was not. It really didn't shake me too much. I've been through 2 bear markets now with Bitcoin, and I've looked at the charts for the others, and it's pretty typical. You have this cycle where you get this sort of irrational exuberance. The price spirals, or I should say, accelerates up into a point where you have a blow off top. The market crashes pretty dramatically. We went from 20,000 for Bitcoin all the way down into the 4,000. I think it might have even gotten into the 3, but definitely around 4,000 was the low. And now we're roughly double from where the low was. And, it seems to me like this is a sustainable rally, and that we're going to most likely continue to see prices moving up from here until we get to another, big kind of, acceleration point again, and then another blow off top. And it'll just most likely we'll be through several more of these until crypto gets to the point where it's a big enough market that it's not so easy to do this, because I think there are probably some big players who are taking advantage, quite frankly, of kind of the inexperienced investors out there, and so they'll get a mania going, and then they'll dump their bags near the top, and they'll walk away with a lot of profits, and then this is true in a lot of markets, but it's something to be aware of for sure in crypto. Bitcoin is now at a 138, $140 billion market cap. So it's getting harder to push it around, but relatively speaking, it's still a very, very small market.
Would that be I've heard a lot about Bitfinance, Tether, that there actually has been some legal cases about manipulation. So it's a little bit kind of like silver and gold past the, the conspiracy theory realm, if we shall call it.
Yeah, I know with Tether, basically the last thing I read was that they admitted to using some of their assets to actually speculate in Bitcoin and other crypto. So basically, they're, instead of collateralizing and holding dollars as they were supposed to do, as they were claiming they were doing, I believe they were basically taking some of those funds and speculating. there's also been charges that they have basically inflated the tether supply beyond the money they had to back those tethers. So this is for sure a little bit troubling, and could also account for some of the bubbles that we've seen in Bitcoin over the last couple of years. And this is exactly why I believe we need to move away from fiat money, because you can't do what they did with Tether with Bitcoin. It's impossible.
Right.
And same with many of the other crypto assets as well. Obviously, there are some exceptions there, but so it's in general, I guess I would like to highlight what I'm excited about with Bitcoin. Is that I've been doing a decent amount of reading into developments with the Lightning Network, and this is a layer 2 scaling solution. And basically, what that means is, the roadmap for Bitcoin is that they want to, keep the base layer very light in terms of the amount of space that you need to store the blockchain. So this is why they haven't raised the block size limit. And there are different opinions on this, but their basic philosophy here is that if the block size becomes too large, then there's a very big danger that there's centralization of the miners and the nodes. And if you have enough centralization, eventually you don't really have a cryptocurrency anymore. You have something that can be easily manipulated. So that's the I guess the underpinning of some of these choices. And so that means if there's a block limit, that we won't be able to scale on chain. In other words, we're not going to be able to have thousands of transactions per second on Bitcoin itself. So Lightning is a simple way to explain this is if how, say, 2 big banks today are doing business together, right? And they have customers and clients who are customers who are making payments, and those payments are going back and forth between those banks. But they're not settling every single time a payment is made. They only settle up maybe once a day or once a week or whatever. They have a certain time frame. So they're basically keeping track of IOUs and then reconciling those occasionally, right? Now, obviously not a great system, but it does work, I guess fairly well, and this is fairly common. So with Bitcoin Lightning Network, if you can take that kind of idea, but instead of having the danger that you're going to have default on the other side, you actually have a Bitcoin smart contract that can be settled immediately if the other side defaults. So you're effectively trading, you could say, paper Bitcoin in a sense, but it's paper Bitcoin that can be settled immediately if you need to. And of course, like any technology, there are some edge case things that you have to look at. One of them is that basically you need to be online watching transactions on the Lightning Network to know that your counterparty doesn't try to rip you off. And obviously, if it's someone you trust, then maybe it's not as big a deal. But generally speaking, we want to mitigate trust in networks like this. We want them to be trustless. In other words, we don't want to have to trust people. So there are some developments there, one of them being a concept called a watchtower, which is basically a third party that participants in the network would pay to just watch transactions. And then basically the third party will have the ability to penalize a nefarious actor and to recover the money to someone who may have been the subject of an attempted breach in the network. So anyway, it gets pretty complicated. But long story short, the network is growing. The transactions on Lightning are growing. It's still in beta, so it's still very early stage. But I'm very excited to see the adoption and the growth. There's a lot of companies building Lightning technology. And then one really cool final point, Lightning Labs is working on something called Loop, which basically one of the problems with Lightning Network is that it can be kind of tricky to get money in and out of the network. And Loop should solve this problem. And basically what that means is you'll be able to put funds onto the network and move them off the Lightning Network without having to close a channel. And having to open and close channels is one of the kind of annoying things about it. So if you can move funds in and out without having to open or close channels, you can keep it open. It should make the network much more useful for people. And this was one of the things I really didn't like about the original implementation. I was concerned about this. So again, this is alpha. The Loop technology is alpha stage. They're very, very early with it. But if it can deliver on what they're promising, this could be a pretty big breakthrough for usability. So long story short, there's a lot of work that needs to be done, but I think in terms of scaling, it definitely is a solution that seems to me to actually be viable.
Right.
And so it's really exciting, and it actually also introduces another layer of privacy, because basically, if you're not broadcasting transactions and you're sending these basically paper bitcoins back and forth, you can trade and you can work essentially anonymously with participants on this network. And so it adds a pretty interesting privacy layer. Not perfect, of course. There's always potentially attack vectors, but a pretty interesting additional layer of privacy. So yeah, bottom line is, for anyone out there, I'm still very, very bullish on Bitcoin. Obviously, there's some other interesting technologies, but if you're just getting into this, you should own Bitcoin. Not Bitcoin Cash, not Bitcoin SV. I mean, again, people are interested in those, but Bitcoin has it has adoption, it has scale, and those things are pretty hard to fight against. And I also like to point out too to people that some people will say, well, Bitcoin is not the best technology. Well, that's also true of TCP/IP and some of these different technology layers that we use for the internet. There are better versions available, but those aren't used because the older versions are, they're everywhere and they're baked into everything. And so there comes a point where there's like an inertia with technology that, it can be very hard to fight if you have enough adoption and enough usage of a technology. So long story short, and also Bitcoin can scale and evolve and change because it's code. So it's not necessarily, unchangeable completely. But yeah, so nonetheless, I still remain very excited about what's happening in Bitcoin. Ethereum is also still interesting to me, and I think it's a project that's worth watching and potentially investing in. On that front, I'm really excited about some of the different additional technologies that are coming out, like Plasma, which is a scaling solution. There's Loom Network, which is for basically hosting content for example, for games. So you could create an Ethereum-based game, and then you can host the assets, like the images and the artwork and so on, can be hosted with Loom. So there's some really cool things happening there. We're going to be releasing, actually for the show that I'm producing for Bitcoin and Friends, we're going to be releasing a series of collectible token, basically characters from the show, but they'll actually be, digitally scarce. So we'll only make, 100 of Bitcoin or 50 or whatever the number is. And we have thoughts too about actually how to turn that into maybe like a trading card game. So we'll probably bake some of that into the smart contracts that we create for those tokens. So we'll see. We could, it could eventually turn into something like Magic the Gathering, or the Hearthstone, the new.
I think where you create the community effect and get folks involved is often a good way to go. And I think that's really been at the heart of the crypto movement, where, again, you've just touched on a bit about how the technology, the security, the speed are continuing to be improved.
Right.
And obviously the other big key is the adoption. Sometimes I think of cryptos similar to a startup. I mean, before people knew what an iPhone was, maybe we didn't know that everybody would want one. Again, here, I would say a lot of the folks that aren't as familiar with cryptos probably are also not as familiar with the problems. I mean, you talked about there may be some security flaws, but it can't be worse than what we're using with the dollar, where we're finding trillions of them missing, however many more printed. So, I mean, is it fair to look at the adoption as, I mean, if we have a currency system that is going to break at some point, and we have people using this, which we've seen in other areas where currencies are falling apart. So if you can comment on adoption and where we're at with there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point to bring up. And I feel really strongly that the first use case of Bitcoin and similar technologies is basically a sovereign, a self-sovereign money, a money that you really can control and own on your own. Obviously, similar in many ways to gold and silver. So, in other words, an actual asset as opposed to a liability on a balance sheet. So you have an asset there, and you have an asset that, of course, the main difference for me with Bitcoin and versus gold and other things is that with Bitcoin you have something that's digitally scarce, but it's also you have the ability to send that money or that asset across the planet for very small amounts of money.
Right.
Um,
Lot less than your typical bank wiring fee, a lot
yeah,
quicker.
yeah, yeah.
If you want to go outside the country, you can go and have access to your money wherever you go.
Right. So that use case is I think still really the killer app with Bitcoin, and it's going to get better as we add scaling solutions and other things to it. But just that use alone, I think, has tremendous value. And obviously, in places like Venezuela, where they really are seeing huge currency crisis and collapse of their money, Bitcoin really shines. And so I think it will continue to be adopted more and more in places where there are more obvious currency problems and currency crises. And it's going to take time, and there's going to be ups and downs. But I really feel at this point that it's starting to become an inevitability with Bitcoin that there's enough momentum now that it's going to be really hard for it to not succeed. That's my honest opinion. And it's just a better money, basically.
Where would you say it's being used the most? Where perhaps is there some place right now where cryptos are being used in the same way that us Americans use cash? Has it gotten that far anywhere? Perhaps where the currencies are struggling?
Yeah, I don't think that it's being used very often for day-to-day purchases. Obviously, there are some people who will use it, and you can get debit cards that are backed by Bitcoin, and then the Bitcoin will be sold when you pay. And so on the front end, you're paying with dollars. On the back end, they sell the Bitcoin to cover that, and that's fine. And there's nothing wrong with that. I don't do that myself because the Bitcoin that I own, I try to hold it for as long as I can. I have used Bitcoin with my business with COINCUBE to pay software developers in other countries. So that's a really great use case. I've paid some Argentinian developers that I would have had a hard time getting money to them because they have crazy capital controls and their government's insane. So, I mean, really, it's so sad. I mean, it's terrible what some people are, being put through. I mean, they've had, how many times have they had hyperinflation? It's like 3 or 4 or 5. It's some huge number in the last 100 years.
It seems like it's almost once a decade now. And I noticed last month, it seemed like some of the credit spreads were blown out again. So it's unfortunate, although ironic. I remember noticing last year, and I think their debt to GDP was 39% here in the U.S. We're over 100%, and that's even before counting the unfunded liabilities and God knows what else isn't publicly accounted for. So
to simply answer the question, I think the main use cases for Bitcoin right now are large international payments or larger type payments where you're crossing borders and you want to have low fees, and the ability to pay whoever you want whenever you want. And then secondly, or maybe that's the second use case. Maybe the first is still just store of value and it's speculative for sure.
Right.
But for those of us who see where the future, where we believe the future is going. I mean, put it this way: for those who have had more than a 6-month or a 1-year time frame on Bitcoin, almost all those people have benefited from buying it. Obviously, there's a few examples, like if you bought at the top of the $20,000 rally, you're still down. But generally speaking, if you buy and hold for 2 years with Bitcoin, two or more, you're going to be in the green, so to speak. As a store of value, and for many people, a tremendous upside has been enjoyed. So, Yeah, I mean, have a long-term mentality with it, and obviously, you know, it's still risky, it's still early, but I do feel the momentum really is building, and the use cases continue to come, you know, kind of trickling along, where we see more and more ways that people are finding how they can use the technology. So, I mean, you know, another point too, this is probably more minor, but I mean, there are companies that are just using the Bitcoin blockchain to anchor other blockchains or other sources of data. Basically to know that they have an immutable time-stamped record of specific things. And so that's actually another very useful you know, use case with Bitcoin. I don't have a metric on that in terms of how much of the usage is based on anchoring data, but it's not insignificant. And there's some pretty big projects using it for that. So yeah, it's cool. It's good to see, you know, we're coming out of this bear market, and I'm excited to see how the next 2 or 3 years shape up for us.
Yeah, and again, you know, for those of us coming from the Austrian economics, gold and silver world, where I think there were a lot of folks that saw the problems in the currency, and kind of like yourself, where you were working in a gold and silver industry before getting into cryptos. So I think there's a lot of interest from people who see the problem, see, well, I don't know whether the dollar is going to collapse today or next year. But for those folks who have looked at cryptos as a response, I remember it was interesting. I had heard a lot of positive things about Litecoin. That's one of the ones I own. And I remember the last time we talked, you kind of indicated that wasn't your favorite based on a bunch of various factors. So maybe first, if you could talk about Litecoin, and then any other relevant ones that folks who are going to cryptos as a dollar or inflation hedge might want to look further into. Prefacing that with, this is not legal financial advice, just two traders discussing the market.
Sure. Well, okay, so Litecoin, the sort of the cynical take on it is basically that doesn't do anything that Bitcoin doesn't do already. So it just, arguably, it doesn't have a huge reason to exist. And that's kind of where I stand on it. But at the same time, you know, there could be arguments to be made for, well, you know, it's been around for a long time. People are using it to some degree, and it does work. And there are people developing the software still, granted, not nearly to the degree that Bitcoin is, but then again, you know, Litecoin was actually, you know, they tested SegWit, which was an upgrade on the Bitcoin network that was a little bit contentious, and they implemented it on Litecoin. So in some ways, Litecoin is sort of like a test network, arguably, for Bitcoin.
I've heard some folks mention that kind of Litecoin went for speed, you know, branding itself as perhaps what we'd be using to buy a cup of coffee in a couple of years, versus Bitcoin being more a store of value, a little slower but safer. The phrasing, the gold to silver, Bitcoin being gold, Litecoin being silver.
Yeah. So Litecoin has a block time of 2.5 minutes. Bitcoin is 10 minutes. I mean, really, that's in some ways kind of inconsequential, because unless you're buying a big ticket item, basically as soon as you broadcast on the Bitcoin network, if it's like a coffee, it's not going to be worth someone trying to double spend that or trying to attack that transaction. It's theoretically possible, but the odds are very, very, very small. And also there are services that merchants pay for, where the service is basically watching the blockchain to make sure that a conflicting transaction isn't broadcast. Because yeah, technically you could have 2 transactions broadcast, and then depending on where those transactions are picked up in the network, you could basically have, you could have a conflict there. So again, you know, for like, you know, for perfect security with Bitcoin, depending on the size of the transaction, you might even want to wait up to six confirmations, which is like an hour. But for small transactions, basically what I'm trying to say is I don't really see that the block time really matters very much. Okay. And so that's, I don't think that's a super valid argument. I mean, I think it was good marketing. You know, Charlie Shrem, the guy that you know, basically forked Bitcoin and created Litecoin, I think he came up with that, and it's a fun kind of gimmicky thing to say. I just don't know if it really matters.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's say that maybe someone on Wall Street notices that China is trading oil in yuan now.
Yeah.
Russia sold their treasuries. I mean, it goes on by the day. So let's say we hit that point where the dollar is finally trading somewhere closer to what it probably is worth.
Right.
What do you think we would be using to buy a cup of coffee? And also perhaps in terms of, if you see a rise in price, what do you think might be ones that, again, folks might just simply want to do further research on?
Yeah, I mean, and that's, in the camp of sort of defending Litecoin a little bit. Litecoin has quite a bit lower transaction throughput, or sorry, not throughput, but the number of transactions are pretty small in that network, and it could handle a lot more capacity at this point. So as like a kind of a blow off valve for Bitcoin, you know what I'm saying? I think it might serve a purpose. And again, it's been useful to some degree as a test network of sorts with some different protocol upgrades. So I don't think it's crazy to own. I mean, I own some Litecoin. I just don't own a lot, and I'm not super bullish on it in terms of long term. But in terms of other, one bit of news that came out pretty recently. So Gemini is working with some company called Flexa, and they have an app where you can buy on Barnes & Noble's, GameStop, Whole Foods. A bunch of pretty big U.S. retailers are signing up with this. And basically, you can use this app to purchase using crypto. Now, as far as I understand on the back end, it's kind of similar to like a debit card, like you're swiping. I don't know exactly what they're receiving on the payment end. They may actually be receiving dollars. And then it gets, the Bitcoin or whatever is sold on the back end. And so I'm not totally up to speed on all the tech on that, but I mean, I guess what I'm saying is I think like short to medium term, I think we're still going to see a lot of payments routing for small purchases and things like that. We're going to still see people using fiat currencies for a while. If the Lightning Network proves to be, the scaling solution that a lot of people are hoping, then we could get to the point where Bitcoin payments for small amounts of coffee and food and so on could be very practical and very easy. And that really could tip the scale then to Bitcoin and similar technologies. I mean, Lightning Network, by the way, can be used on other networks as well. So other crypto. So for example, there's like Library project, which is like a decentralized YouTube. They're adding Lightning Network because they basically used a fork of Bitcoin for their network. So any fork of Bitcoin can use Lightning Network, for example. And so, so I think we're still at that point where, these sort of base level protocols are starting to be trusted. And now it looks like the solution for scaling in many cases, or most cases, is going to be some sort of layer 2 technology. And I think we're getting closer to having those be a reality that can be useful for everyone. It might still be a year or two out. But that's my hope, and that should really help the adoption cycle, because if you are at a point in a year from now where we're using Lightning and you can immediately send payment to anyone anywhere, and it costs basically nothing except for when you close or open a channel, then you're talking, and maybe you're paying a watchtower a small amount. So there still might be very small fees, but it's going to be very minimal. And then I think we see people getting more and more interested in using it as a payment. But again, kind of the devil's advocate side of this is that as Bitcoin continues to be volatile in the short to medium term, it's going to be hard for some people to feel comfortable using it as a means of payment. So I still think, it's more likely in my mind that what we'll probably see in the next year or two is we'll get more institutional people playing in Bitcoin and trading it. And we'll see Bitcoin being used more and more as a means of settlement between large institutions. One idea I heard from a podcast recently was this idea that Bitcoin could potentially be used as collateral So if two banks are paying each other, they actually would transfer Bitcoin in the background to
Right.
basically collateralize those payments.
That would certainly be a big market.
Yeah, right. So there's, yeah, I think there's a lot of ways this can go, and I'm all for the adoption of it on the personal finance level, and I want people to be there. But it could be a while before we get to the point where it's super easy to use this stuff on a day-to-day basis. But that doesn't mitigate the value proposition, and I think we'll get there.
Well, I agree. Similar to the metals, I think the value is there, although having a longer time horizon is certainly something that will serve you well.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
And again, just wrapping up, Robert, you also do have some great trading software for folks who might be getting into trading. If you can let them know about COINCUBE, where they can find you, and again, appreciate everything you shared today.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the reminder to plug. So coincube.io is the website, coincube.io. And you can use the software there to set up a crypto index. So if you just want to buy the top 5 or 10 or 15 or whatever assets, that can be done pretty easily. The funds will be held on exchanges, which does have a little bit of risk there. So, my advice to people is if you're just getting in, I would just buy some Bitcoin and hold on to it. If you've been in it a little while and you want to dabble a little bit further, CoinCube could be useful for that. You can also use it to do like swing trading type setups, and there's a couple different things that can be done with the software. But you can poke around and check it out, and obviously email support@coincube.io if you have questions or any issues or anything. So. But yeah, that's been really fun building that software and seeing people enjoy using it. The only other thing I guess I plug real quick is Bitcoin and Friends is a crypto cartoon like Rick and Morty, South Park-esque. So it's definitely not for children, but it's a lot of fun. We just released first episode about roughly 2 months ago, and we will be releasing episode 2 on June 15th.
And you can send us a link we can post at the bottom.
Yeah, it's btcandfriends.com.
I did enjoy it. And I think any crypto folks would really enjoy watching that. Kind of in the same way we had those little Muppets to make fun of the Federal Reserve officials. So I appreciate you have some technical solutions, also providing some stuff just to make life fun, which is nice too. So Robert Allen of COINCUBE, which you can find at coincube.io. It's been great watching your success as you've progressed. And I guess 8 years we've known each other now.
Yeah, it's been a fun journey.
Yeah, excited to see what happens next. Pleasure having you on. So thank you, my friend, and we'll check in with you again soon.
Thanks, Chris.